Okay, so moving on from our last video, we're going to now look at how we're going to get our mocap characters set up to be able to drive our FBX models that we're going to import. Now, a quick aside before we start. Some of you may have noticed in the last video, there was a bit of a mistake in there. If I open the last file, you'll see what I'd managed to do by accident is delete one of the bones out of Andy's rig. So you'll see here I deleted the forearm bone. This is something just as an aside note to you to just make sure that you double click in the viewport to deselect anything before you go deleting or adding things to group or creating new groups. If you want to keep it clean, whatever you have selected, double click to deselect like this. I've got stuff selected, double click to deselect, and then start reselecting things again. Yeah. Otherwise you might end up with something similar to this, me not realizing that I deleted a forearm bone by accident. So I'm going to go back to another version that I re-imported and set up and fixed. And now we have all of our takes in. You can see here, take 001, we don't actually need that. So we can go down here into our navigator window. There's no animation data in that take. It's a default one, blank take that's left there in Motionbuilder. We can delete that if you so wish, if we don't need it. And now we just only have our fight takes in here. If I go to take 2, it would create a new one. These are the existing ones. So let's go in and have a look at the first ROM, which would be Andy's ROM. Now again, everything is visible on this layer. If I scrub it, only Andy moves, but we have other objects in there because they're loaded into Motionbuilder. So this is where we can come and use our group. I'm going to hide the swords and hide Lindell, and let's have a look at Andy's ROM. So Andy is stood in a T-pose. Now T-pose, as we've covered in the lectures, has two uses effectively. The T-pose in the Mocap studio allows us to get a clear view of all the markers before we start recording. And then in something like Motionbuilder, Maya, any sort of DCC tool, it allows us to set a kind of a bind pose or a calibration pose for our character. Now in Motionbuilder, the T-pose is very important because of a process named characterization. Motionbuilder uses a system called Human IK, which is a way of mapping bipedal and quadrupedal skeletons into a sort of unified system that can talk across to other bipeds or quadrupeds. So if I characterize the mocap skeleton and I characterize another FBX character, they can talk to each other because they understand what they are. They understand each other are bipeds, they have gaits, collisions, arms, legs, and bone naming conventions that are similar and exchange data across. And that's how Human IK works. That's the power of Motionbuilder. Now, some of these features have been taken into Maya now, but I still think that Motionbuilder has the most comprehensive sort of Human IK tool set, plus the fact that it can deal with multiple takes very easily instead of having lots of layers to unhide and hide and do all sorts in Maya. It's still the purest form of human. It's got a characterization for Human IK. So I'm going to refer you back to one of the websites that I've talked about. So Mocapies, how to rig a character for Motionbuilder, really important topic. And this is what I've basically used to underpin my characters that I've shared with you in the FBX folder. So I have followed these conventions. So when I characterize, Motionbuilder wants my character with as many bones as possible parallel to the world axis facing in the positive Z direction. So if we have a look here, we can see the axes in the corner. When we get our actors, when we calibrate our volume in our Mocap studio, we get our actors then to face in the positive Z direction. So when they stand looking at us behind the mocap desks with a T-pose to take directions for their ROM, they are standing in positive Z. And that is why we use the ROM takes to do our characterization. If we went into fight section, you can see here, Andy is maybe facing in the right direction. He's a little bit offset, but Lyndall is not. If you characterized Lyndall's skeleton in this take, it would give highly inaccurate results. And I know some of you have seen this already. You'll get the arms flipped about, the legs flipped about, because Motionbuilder assumes that the character is facing the positive z-axis with all limbs parallel to the world axis or in line with one of the world axes, to give you the cleanest characterization. And that is why we must use the ROM takes to do our characterization process. So I'm going to jump back to Andy's ROM now and hide all the others. So we've got Andy skeleton only. Just double check there. Select one of the bones. It is Andy ROM skeleton. Now, Andy's done a good job of standing in a T-pose, but it is not a clean T-pose as far as Motionbuilder would like it. As you'd see in these, very parallel, arms parallel to the floor plane, legs straight up. And I want this to match a pose of my characters that I've built. The whole characterization process shows offsets. So if both of my characters are posed at exactly the same time, exactly the same pose when I characterize them, I don't have to compensate for those rotational offsets. If the arms are off, then the legs are off and everything's not parallel, but one of the other models is, there will be an offset. And I'll demonstrate that for you now, actually. So another quick aside, I'm going to add the FBX models character into Motionbuilder now. And to do that, we go to the asset browser in the resources panel down the bottom, go to the asset browser tab, and normally it's opened like this with the templates folder open, but I'm just going to close it up so I can right click in a blank space and say add favorite path. Now the reason we're going to do this is it just makes adding FBX models much easier to our scene, but just a drag and drop functionality with some options as we drop them, rather than having to go up to our file menu and merge and set everything up. We're just going to add the favorite path and then we can drag and drop the models in there. So if I come here and say add favorite path, and I'm going to navigate to the folder where I have CT6 Mocap fight sequence and all of those corresponding folders, and I'm just going to select the FBX models folder and click OK. So now you'll see that I've brought in that folder and you'll see the objects that are in there. We've got two versions of the assassin, two lightsabers and two sword props. And again, now you can use these. I don't mind who you assign. You can make Lyndall the evil one or Lyndall the good character. It doesn't matter. Just tell me about this in the report. You can give them a lightsaber each, or you can give them a sword prop each. I don't mind. Each of those will allow you to retarget and give me valid feedback in your Motionbuilder file to be able to see your workings. So let's do a test characterization for now. So say I'm going to if I just go with this T-pose and I open up templates, go to characters and drag and drop a character into the scene. So I make sure one of the bones, any of the bones highlighted, I could do it on the leg, I could do it there. It reads the whole hierarchy. So if I drag and drop there and say characterize, biped, it's done. Motionbuilder has set this skeleton up. It's got a certain bone naming convention, and all the stuff we export from Shogun has that naming convention. So there was no prompts here about bone names being different or anything. It read all the bone names as it expected and characterized our character instantly. And it's taken this position as our kind of zeroed characterization position. So if I bring in another character now, let's bring in Assassin Good. And I drag from the folder, drop into the scene and say FBX merge, no animation, and in comes my Assassin character. So if I go to display X-ray, you'll see now that the Assassin character has been squared off. The legs are parallel with each other and perpendicular to the ground. The arms are squared off and are parallel to the ground, but our mocap skeleton is not. So just for the purpose of demonstration, if I do no adjustment here, not even resizing the assassin, let's just characterize our assassin to characterize biped. Now we've done two characterizations here, and to find those we have this drop-down menu at the top. We have this menu, sorry, character controls in the top right-hand side, and we then have character entries in our navigator. So the first one I characterized was Andy. And this is why it's important to rename. So if I just right-click there, rename it, call that Andy Mocap. And then the second one that I did is the assassin, and call it assassin good. They're both characterized now. So one can be driven by the other. Now we're obviously not going to drive the mocap with the assassin character because the assassin has no animation data on it. So if I come up to this character controls and I see here we have Andy Mocap and Assassin Good, so I'm going to say Assassin Good is the character, and then the source for that will be Andy Mocap. And now you saw them move into position, and if I do this now, you'll see that it's being driven by the motion capture, but all of the positions are quite far off. Yeah. The arms are not in place, the skeleton's not in place. That's because there was an offset. If we look at one of the fight takes, this is even more obvious. If I unhide all the others, you'll see now when the mocap character picks up his sword, let's just zoom in here. So because the mocap was shot for the sword and the actor at the same time, we have accurate placement. And he's picked up his sword, but look, the actor's hand, the assassin's hand, is miles away from that. Now, there's no easy way of fixing that. I could change the target to that to try and do that. I could go into retargeting, and one of the things I'll show you in a later video is match source, which makes it absolute. So the feet have jumped into position, and I'm now trying to get that hand to lock in and do all of that. But watch what happens when for that single frame it doesn't look too bad, but now if I zoom in and see this as models only, you'll see that arm is very straight. There's a lot of tension in that rig. It just doesn't read naturally. There's too much stretching and pulling going on in the IK to make that a valid retarget. It's because we did no alignment. So we're going to go back in a second and do some automatic alignment. We're going to do some manual alignment, of our characters to make sure that when we link them together, they have a much more accurate calibration to each other. Yeah. So the process for doing that is it's manual and there's a little bit of work done, but I'm going to go through that now, and it shouldn't take too long to do that at all. It's a case of going to our mocap skeleton, zeroing out all the bones to make them parallel at frame 0, adding a keyframe because it has existing animation, and then resetting up our characters and bringing them in. So I'm going to go back to my scene now without the assassin loaded in. I'm going to go back to Andy ROM 001, hide everything other than Andy. And now I'm going to select all the bones. So one of the things I was going to show you here, if I draw Ragamaki, I'm trying to make things as quick as possible. There's another option here you might want to turn off, transparency selection, because that basically does a line of sight and you might not select things. So if I put that on and I drag around, you might see now, because it couldn't quite see everything, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Just deselect that, turn that option off to make marquee selecting easier. But if I'm trying to select the bones, it's difficult to do that without selecting the markers at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up another group to contain all of the markers so I can hide them when I need them hidden, to select them, make selecting the bones a bit easier. So to do that, I'm going to go into the scene part in the navigator, and I'm going to scroll up, select the first one, hold shift, and scroll all the way down to the last set of marker, the last marker in Lindell. And then I'm just going to deselect one node in the middle of that, Andy Hips. So now I have all the markers selected for Lindell and Andy, and I can now go in here and create a new group and call that markers. And now I can turn those off and I can select the skeleton more easily. Yeah, just going to save this scene now as a new one and call that setup 3 and call this what? Characterising mocap skeletons. Yeah. So I'm just going to hide the markers. I've got Andy's ROM take just to double check. Andy's skeleton is in there. So we need to zero out all of these bones within this skeleton. So I can select them all. I can right click, 0 rotation, and I get a nice parallel rig. But that's introduced a problem. The clavicles. The mocap rig uses swept clavicles, so they sweep backwards to the shoulder position to give us more accurate representation of how our clavicle bones actually work on our physical skeletons. So I don't want to zero those out, because that would then cause problems with the shoulders. So I need to select all of the bones and then use Shift to deselect those clavicles and then right click, 0 rotation. Now, the problem with that is they've zeroed out based on their parent, which is the clavicles, so these arms will need a little bit of adjustment. So what I'm going to do, now I've done that, I'm just going to select everything, and I need a keyframe. This has animation. If I scrub the timeline now, it won't register any of these. It hasn't keyframed any of this. It will go back to the original. So I'll do that now and show you. Look, if I do that, go back to 0, they're all back as they were. So again, I'm going to deselect those clavicles, 0 all the rotation, and now I'm going to set a keyframe there. Just click the key button and you see a little star on there to say a key has been set. So if I scrub now and then go back to 0, I now have that pose. So my legs are fine. The spine is good enough. The neck is good. The arms are straight. They just need to be put into position so they are parallel with the world axes in different views. So if I go to, say, I'm going to go to the view, drop down at the top, orthographic, front. I'm going to zoom in. And now what I'm going to do is select one of these bones, set rotate, and I want to rotate it on the local axis. I don't want to rotate it on global. I want to rotate it on the local to make sure valid offsets are preserved. So make sure you change that to local. And now I'm going to set the arm sort of parallel there. I'm using the right mouse button. If I use the left mouse button, it gives me big movements. If I use the right mouse button, it gives me fine movements. So holding the right mouse button on the Z axis, make that parallel. Actually, once I've done that, because I have it selected, keyframe it. Bring the other one down now. We've got a difference here because our clavicles are not level. So there's two ways I can do it. I can either bring this clavicle down to match this one or bring this one up. So if I bring, if I bring that one, sometimes it's difficult selecting the right gimbal. Bring that up roughly, and then that one back down. Okay. And now quickly I can just select all of those because I've been working on the arms, set another keyframe, and let's check the top view now. So go to view, orthographic top, and now I'm going to come into the top view, and I'm going to do the same. I'm going to make them parallel, like that, roughly speaking, looks about right. And now again I can just go like that, select the bones that I've moved, keyframe them again, go back to producer perspective, and now I have a nice, the arms and legs are parallel, the spine is straight as I want it, and the neck is too. So I now have a very similar pose of my mocap skeleton to characterize it to the assassin characters that I'm going to bring in. Yeah. So if I scrub forwards on a frame, you'll see it jumps to the mocap, back to 0, I now have a lovely zeroed out pose for my actor. So now that I've done that, let's characterize it. I'm going to go to the asset browser, characters, here, drag over the character onto one of the bones of Andy, characterize, biped. Now, good practice is to just name that straight away. So if I come down to Navigator, go to Characters, select this one, rename Andy Mocap, and then save this file. Okay, so that's Andy done. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and do the same thing with Lyndall in her ROM take. And then we'll have our two mocap characters ready for ready to bring in our FBX models. So I'm going to jump to Andy, from Andy's ROM take to Lyndall. But remember, I need to hide Andy and unhide Lyndall. Now, because we have two groups controlling the markers, effectively each actor and this one, it'll come back on automatically. So I'm going to turn the markers off, and now I can select Lyndall's skeleton more easily. Now, what I've noticed here is the character controls for Andy is left behind, which could make selection a bit tricky. It's not going to matter on the first frame, so I can just be lazy. I can select all of those, deselect the clavicles, deselect these character collision control. Actually, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to delete Andy's characterization. Just say yes to all, because I don't want to select the controls for that by accident, because it leaves those behind. So again, now I'm going to Lyndall's skeleton. What I'm going to do is I'll go back and characterize both of them in at the same time once I've zeroed them out. So let's just zero out Lyndall's character. Turn off the clavicles, right click, zero rotation. Let's go to our front view again. Oops, I don't want to have all of them selected. Let's get that arm. Make that parallel. Bring that one down. And again, we have a similar thing with the clavicle. So I'm just going to bring this clavicle up a little. Put that arm back down so it's parallel in this viewport. And the same on this one. Select those bones again and key them all. Actually, I need to do that on all of them. So select all of the bones and keyframe that. Go back to producer perspective. Let's check we still got that nice sweep on the clavicles. So now I'm going to go to the top view. Now we can see one of the clavicles is pushed further backwards than the other. So I'm just going to bring that back. Making these arms sort of perpendicular and parallel to the grid lines. Doesn't look too bad. Maybe that clavicle needs to come forward a little. Oops. A little lower. That's about right. And then put those arms parallel again. Just select all of those and keyframe that. Producer perspective, and then scrub forwards, go back to 0 and check, and I've got those frames. So now I can characterize my two actors. So I'm in Lyndall's take with everything visible. So let's do that for Lyndall now. Characters, in templates, drag over and let go of the mouse button. Characterize, biped, go to characters, rename that to Lyndall Mocap. So let's switch to Andy's ROM take, hide Lyndall, unhide Andy, and do the same thing again. Drag and drop the character, characterize, biped, and then rename that to Andy Mocap. So we now have our two mocap skeletons characterized using frame 0 where we've zeroed everything out, and now that the rest of the mocap data is preserved as we need. We're not going to use the T-poses if we're going to use this in animation, so we clip it afterwards. So just having one frame with a 0 out doesn't make any difference to our animation. Even if you're working on some mocap that hasn't got T-poses shot at the beginning, you could still select the character, 0 it out, position it, and characterize, because you're only sacrificing one frame of your animation to do this. So it's perfectly valid to do that. So we have Lyndall's ROM as well, now with everything characterized. So we are now ready to drive some of our any FBX model that's characterized as well. So I'm going to finish this video here now. I don't want to keep going just yet. This will cover the characterization process. So let's just recap on what we did. We set up an extra group to hide the markers just to make selection easier. And then in each of the ROM takes for Andy, I went to frame 0 and I zeroed out the rig except the clavicles, making the arms parallel to the world axis to give us a nice square pose, the same as the model that we brought in as an example earlier on. And then I did the same with Lyndall on frame 0. I then dragged and dropped our characters on top of them, renamed them to make sense, and saved my file. And then we'd be ready to start bringing in our other character FBX models that we're going to retarget to. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next video.